So sorry, I don't know if law students generally would be having to study this, but the issue of a referendum you touched on, and that's, let's say, a new element in our constitutional democratic understanding in the last few decades. But clearly, Dicey observed it in Switzerland and recommended it as a kind of political device when he thought Parliament might vote, in his mind, the wrong way on Irish Home Rule. So it's been there in the background, but I wonder if that's an example of the wider implications of this Brexit saga for our understanding of our democracy over the next few years, perhaps the future of the Union, perhaps the voting system for the Commons, perhaps other issues.
Well, it's interesting because the fallout from the referendum, complex as it's been, has nevertheless led to calls for further referenda
Yes.
on, whether it's the second Scottish referendum or second Brexit referendum or other referendum. And in recent decades, and perhaps with increasing pace in recent years, as you say, we've had referenda. So the alternative vote system referendum, obviously the Scottish independence referendum, and the Brexit referendum. And so the challenge is that there is no sort of constitutional framework for a referendum to take place. It requires a specific piece of legislation to set out the terms and how it will work and the question and all the franchise, all those kind of things. In each case, with a very, very limited sort of framework, statutory framework within which to work. So there isn't, and even beyond that, the kind of the sovereign role of the people underpinning the kind of formal sovereignty of Parliament is not really that well elucidated, understood within the Constitution. And again, broadly, it's perhaps an example of where Parliament in an individual statute can do something like that. But it could do things like introduce the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, for example, which may have served its purpose narrowly between 2010 and 2015 with a coalition government, but now it's causing all sorts of problems for a government desperate for an election and a Parliament, that has other priorities at this moment. And whether the individual statutes on devolution to the nations, House of Lords reform, and things like that, a lot of the times they're individual moves that lack a kind of constitutional framework within which they sit. But they're big constitutional moves, so it becomes quite a challenge, quite a tension within the Constitution.
Yes, so you might have thought that referendums wouldn't be very popular now, given the mess, but the reaction seems to be more, as you say, partly we may need another referendum to sort this one out, but also we need to learn lessons from what's gone right or wrong in not just this referendum, but the Scottish independence referendum. One of the things seems to be the use of it as a political device on the assumption that the government that's called it thinks it's going to win, without really thinking through what happens if you lose.
Yes.
That seems to be a big concern. And there would be ways of sorting that out, wouldn't there, in terms of some independent body monitoring. At the moment, the actual question has to be approved, but it could look at the conditions under which the whole thing is conducted. For instance, in Ireland, there have been various referendums on, for instance, abortion law, and it's gone different ways. But ultimately, the last time the people in the Republic of Ireland voted, it was clearly set out the kind of law that would come in if they voted to allow it at all. And with the benefit of hindsight, you might say, the kind of deal that might have been aimed for, obviously you can't be certain what the other side in the negotiation will agree, but the kind of deal that might be aimed for could have been set out, I suppose. Even early on in the saga after the referendum, we heard talk of Canada or Norway plus or plus plus. There were ways of describing the kind of thing you're aiming for. Do you think that's the way that the Constitution will go?
I think to try and overcome this sort of chaos, if we're going to continue to use referendums, you need some sort of more formal structure. Because, you mentioned the last Irish referendum, also there seemed to be a much more structured deliberative process as part of that decision, whereas this, Brexit referendum seemed a much more piecemeal ad hoc process. So it was announced it would happen, legislation was passed, then it's only an advisory, it's a political move in Darcian terms because it's only advisory, and nothing in the statute said it would be seen as binding. But then the government took a policy decision to say it would be implemented, but then because the government effectively lost, then it resigned. David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister, and so a new government took over, and so yes, there was no certainty, no structure, no thinking about I suppose what would happen next if the government lost, beyond perhaps resigning, and perhaps because they weren't expecting to. And I think that it could be a lesson, hopefully, to future governments in that they weren't that far away from losing the Scottish independence referendum, and did lose from the government of the day's point of view the Brexit referendum. That there needs to be some sort of clearer structure and framework, otherwise you're left with a real mess afterwards to sort out.
And there are two things which I think students might want to consider coming out of what you say there. One is, you might want to pluck an example from another jurisdiction. We've chosen ones close to home. But let's take another example. New Zealand, the Prime Minister a few years back decided, almost out of thin air, to raise the issue whether there should be a new flag, because at the moment it contains a small version of the Union flag or the Union Jack. But that was agreed that they would look at it. And they had a good process, I think, which was to commission or to invite designs and to commission designs, to have a process, a long list, a short list. Then the public voted on the best alternative. Once they got that, they then had a referendum on the best alternative against the current flag, and the current flag won. So you could say, well, it was a waste of time, but actually it was probably a good process to go through. And something like that, depending on what the issue is, obviously, but something like that could be considered. But if somebody in constitutional law classes says, what about America, Switzerland, Ireland, New Zealand, then we have that process of legal reasoning or any kind of reasoning, which is, well, there are some similarities, but maybe you're talking about a different kind of culture, political culture, different kind of issue, different time. And I think that's an important issue. That's number one. Number two is, have we ended up trivialising the vote in a political context? Possibly because we're now used to voting in other contexts. If you vote for X Factor, Britain's Got Talent, Love Island, I'm a Celebrity, Strictly Come Dancing.
Yeah.
If you're voting a couple of years ago to keep in Ed Balls because you think it's funny, then when you've got a referendum involving people like Ed Balls, do you vote for or against a proposition because you don't like Mr. Cameron or Mr. Johnson or whoever it might be? Or can we all see that these are different and you might have a bit of fun with some vote, but this is very serious? So two questions. What's the value of comparative law or politics? And secondly, what about the vote itself?
Oh, easy questions. By the way, I think Ed Balls was a better dancer than he was given credit for.
I thought you were going to say that he was a politician.
Also. I think comparative law is very useful. I think we teach comparative aspects to the UK Constitution here and public law, and I think that it is important to set in context the UK Constitution, which can often be seen as a unique outcome of a specific historical process, which it is, but so is every constitution, and you can see still dealing with similar issues in many cases. But you do need to, some constitutional frameworks have codified accounting for referendums in there, and obviously the UK uncodified constitution doesn't have. So you do have to be careful when making comparisons, what you're comparing, how you're comparing, and which things are like for like. And it's a political culture is as much a part of that as kind of legal doctrine. But definitely they are valuable, and I think it would be sensible to start somewhere by looking around if we were to try and to adopt some sort of framework for referendums in the future.
In terms of taking the vote seriously,
Yes.
do you think that's been an issue or not?
I wonder how strong a sense of the democratic purpose, the purpose of voting, and representative democracy in government, how strong that sense is, and whether that's been clouded, whether by voting in reality TV or whatever, or whether by sort of personality politics, which may be related to that whole, I think perhaps we could do more to understand why we vote and how our vote is transferred into action at a government level.
Yes, and I think that's important, and it relates back to an issue in the judgment, which is about the constitutional responsibility of the Prime Minister in exercising this prerogative. The court was in effect saying you shouldn't be using words like rigmarole to describe the prorogation ceremony and so on, because it suggests you are trivialising your constitutional role. You've got to take it responsibly. And similarly, the court itself has to be responsible. And when people criticise, as students and lecturers do, the judges or the politicians for just deciding because they're against the EU or they're pro-Brexit or against Brexit or they're Remoaners or whatever, maybe we're just accusing other people of our own faults. But if they've got a responsible position, then you'd like to think that they were taking it very seriously. And maybe that's one of the issues that we come to in a constitutional law course, about feeling a sense of duty to take these important decisions for the common good. But as you say, it gets mixed up with personality politics and also the media, who I think are very important. And I'll use that word again, the trivialisation of the personalities of the judges or what they're wearing or those kinds of things. There is a value in the majesty of the law and the symbolism of the law, and I think that the giving of reasons in public is a very important contribution which the courts make.
Yes, and I think a lot of the language used by politicians and the media has been trivialising and reductive of the views of the other side, and divisive or pejorative. And that doesn't help us to take on those duties seriously, I think, because there's a sort of response to the increasing heightened rhetoric of the other side and so on. And I think the fairly reasoned presentation of, in contrast to the government, which was unwilling to give reasons really for the prorogation beyond what appeared to be a fairly evident sort of facade. The court, by publicly giving reasons, as you say, and often requiring public bodies to give reasons, it plays an important role in that sort of process, which needs to be deliberative and sort of not trivialised, to use the word of music.
Yeah. And so to conclude our series of conversations, going back to my postgraduate studies of law, which were in America, a phrase that was used there was about high constitutional moments. Sometimes there are very special issues in America, probably to do with slavery, race discrimination, the quest for equality. Here it looks like Brexit and independence for the different parts of the United Kingdom. And these high constitutional moments need to be treated seriously. You need to have a big public debate, preferably before the decisions. And you need then to learn the lessons from it for the everyday constitutional issues of the next generation. So I hope that these conversations have prompted students and others to think about how to take lessons from Brexit forwards into our democracy. Simon, thank you very much.